Chapter 5 of Save the Girls by Mason Long. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The perils of poverty, pitfalls for the working girls, how they are led to destruction. In a preceding chapter I have spoken of the several principal causes of the ruin of women. Some inherit their vicious tendencies, others fall because of misplaced affections. Many sin through a love of dress, which is fostered by society and by the surroundings amidst which they may be placed. Many, very many, embrace a life of shame to escape from poverty. In this chapter I shall briefly consider some of the many temptations to which poor young girls are exposed, especially in our cities and large towns, showing how so many innocent maidens have been thoughtlessly led astray and crossed the Rubicon which separates the pleasant land of modesty and virtue from the deep gulf of vice and misery, from which not 1 in 100 is ever saved. The poor girls who are unfortunate enough to be born with a natural tendency to vice are certainly to be pitied. They inherit the evil propensities which prove their ruin from licentious and profligate ancestors, and are just as certain to drift out into the great current of sin and shame which is forever running through our cities and towns, as the river is to flow to the sea. Their vicious tendencies develop themselves at an early age, and of all the sad sights to be seen in the purlieus and slums, on the streets and in the alleys of our great cities, none is more heartrending, more sickening than that of mere children, hardened courtesans, lost to all sense of shame and decency, and as depraved and degraded at the age of 13 or 14 as the vilest harridan. These wretched creatures are, for the most part, the children of wicked profligate men and women. They are born in an atmosphere of vice, and reared amidst surroundings of the most degrading and demoralizing character. Most of them are raised by their parents with no other aim than to make them harlots, and at a tender age are sold by fathers and mothers into an existence which is worse than slavery itself. Startling as these facts are, they should be known. These wretched creatures are reared in ignorance, are surrounded by the most demoralizing influences, are cut off from the blessings of church and Sabbath school, are familiar with licentiousness and profligacy and crime of all kinds in their earliest childhood. The moral sense is dead within them. There is nothing in them for the moralist or the preacher to appeal to. They have no aspirations for purity. Indeed, they have no conception of it. They have no comprehension of modesty. To them it is a stranger, and has been from the cradle. These wretched outcasts are creatures of the gutter and the pavement from birth. They are women of the town from the beginning. What else is left for them? What can be done to help these hopeless human beings? God above only knows. We can hope for them and pray for them, but certainly nothing much short of a miraculous interposition of divine power can redeem those who seem so lost to all conception of modesty, of decency, and of virtue. Those I have just spoken of are such as have selected their degraded calling, or rather have had it chosen for them in advance, and who have had no idea of any other kind of a life than that in which they were born and raised. But they do not happily constitute a majority of the fallen women of today. A large majority are those whose natural tendency is to virtue and modesty, but who in moments of weakness have succumbed to the temptations which surrounded them, and having once fallen, have been forced by society to follow the terrible pathway of open shame. It is of these and of the causes of their downfall that I would speak in this chapter. The temptations to vice which accompany poverty prove irresistible to many, many thousands of poor girls who are naturally chaste and virtuous, but who are driven by penury, want, and starvation to the sacrifice of their most precious treasure, and the hopeless wrecking of their lives and souls. Poverty, says Dr. Hauser, with that word poverty come the echoes of 1,000 woes and 1,000 crimes. Parents too poor to clothe themselves bring children into the world, children for whom they have no bread. The girl, more than the boy, feels the keen pang of want, the sense of shame for lack of clothing. She feels that there is no place in all the wide world for her, that she is an outcast, brought into the world by parents incapable of giving her the comforts and blessings of a good home, which are due to every child. Upon developing into womanhood, she finds seeming friends, believes them real, confides and falls, may be forced to a life of shame for bread. Many girls thus fall that are naturally good, and would have remained so had not poverty and cruelty destroyed all of their finer feelings, outraged their natures, wronged their spirits, crushed their hopes, blighted their fondest expectations, broken their tender, loving hearts, and cast them adrift on the surging waves of a loveless world. They fall, and may God pity them. In this world none love and none forgive them. But I believe there is a world across the valley of sunless shadows where rose-tinted beams of eternal light fold like angels' wings o'er the dawn of a day that will bring to such of the fallen the matchless blessing of ceaseless rest. The eminent scientist and physician, Dr. Dio Lewis, in his work on chastity, after naming some of the causes of prostitution, says, "The case of the working girl who loses her virtue is still more sad. Hunger and unkindness assail her, her bloom fades, her future is a black distance into which she dares not look. Temptation comes to her whose weakness should be a protection against the basest libertine that breathes. Warmth and comfort and love are offered, her thoughts dwell on the subject incessantly. Virtue becomes at last an idle name to her, not the symbolic word whose translation is a pure life. She falls, and her fatal course can never be retraced." In the same work I find the following story, which is an excellent illustration of the temptations to which poor girls are subjected in our large cities. A true story. Virginia T. came to Boston from a country town in Maine. She came as thousands of young women have come, seeking employment. Now, out of the humdrums of her native town, and conscious of ability to achieve a career, she wept a farewell to mother and sisters, and filled with ambitious hopes, came to Boston to seek her fortune. Her neighbors foretold shipwreck, but a young woman, a neighbor 2 years older than herself, had gone to New York, when about her age, 23, and in a single year had established herself in the confidence of prosperous employers. Virginia saw no reason why, after always leading that young woman in the studies at school, she might not be able, with her brighter faculties, to make her way, and thus be able to realize her dead brother's plan of providing for the loved parents when they should become too old to take care of themselves. So she came. Her first engagement, after trying 2 weeks to find something better, was running a sewing machine in a ready-made clothing establishment. She was placed in an immense room with 150 other girls. One of the girls, who seemed superior to the others, immediately took Virginia under her wing, for which the country girl was very grateful. Nan soon explained things to Virginia, and induced her to leave her boarding house and take a little room near hers in the 4th story, over a business house where there were more than 50 rooms rented to young women. Virginia was so unsophisticated that it was a month before she suspected that Nan's companion was other than her husband, and that the young men she saw about every evening were there with illicit purpose. She had received such kindness at the hands of her fellow lodgers that when at length the character of the place dawned upon her, she thought it was not a bit the horrid place that she had always heard described. And although she left it at once, still, when her friend Nan and the other girls laughed at her squeamishness and assured her that in this way they were able to retain all their wages for dress, and that if they got into trouble there were doctors, enough of them, who could get them out of it in a week or two. Poor Virginia did not shudder at all, as she would have expected, but being ambitious, she left and secured board in a distant part of the city. When by herself, she constantly recurred to the little, happy, well-dressed community downtown, and was often shocked that the thought of such a life did not bring with it a deeper sense of humiliation and shame. After a few months, she secured a better position in a hoop-skirt factory downtown, and at the end of 2 years from the time of leaving her home in Maine she returned for a visit, not only well dressed but with a full purse. Then came the great fire. She was thrown out of employment and found nothing to do, until at the end of 2 months she was unable to meet her board bill and had to move. In this strait she called upon her old friends, and found them as full of card parties, theaters, etc. as ever. With many solemn vows and painful misgivings, she accepted their hearty offer to provide for her until she could find another situation. Soon she accepted an invitation to attend church one evening with a pleasant young man, to whom, as Virginia afterwards learned, one of her girl companions had made a suggestion. Then she visited the theater with him. After a week or two he proposed marriage. The surroundings excited her suspicions, but she promised to think of it. In the meantime he begged her to use his purse, and not to be dependent upon poor working girls. Entirely helpless and unable to obtain employment, she consented to borrow a little money, with the distinct understanding that she was to return it with interest. Before the hard winter was over, the sum had grown to nearly $100. Since then about 10 months have passed, and now she might be heard, after they have retired at night, pleading with him to have the marriage ceremony performed. He says to her, "Why, Jenny, we are just as much married as any couple in the world. My darling, don't worry in this way. It will come out all right." He will abandon her at last, and 5 years from now, when she is picked up a drunken prostitute, the above true story will hardly be believed by those who realize only her shame and depravity. The same author, whose investigations and labors among fallen women have been very extensive, tells the following thrilling story, which is so touching, so suggestive, so true to nature, that I cannot forbear reproducing it entire. The Beginning and the End. One evening there was a knock at my office door, and a young girl entered whose sunken eyes and tawdry dress stamped her as belonging to that wretched class whose trade it is to pander to the passions of men. She approached me hurriedly, and without any preliminary words of greeting said, "Doctor, I've got a friend who is very sick. I'm afraid she is going to die. Will you come and see her?" Her voice broke, and she turned away with tears in her eyes, perhaps the purest she had shed for many a day. I arose and put on my hat. "Wait a moment," said she. "I have no money, and neither has she. But if you can trust the likes of me, I'll pay you, if I live long enough." "Never mind that," said I. "Let us go to your friend as soon as possible." She said nothing, but there was an eloquence greater than words in the grateful light that beamed in her poor faded eyes. She led the way to an old tenement house on one of the worst streets in the city, up flight after flight of rickety stairs, until we reached an attic room that bore every evidence of extreme poverty. It was a cold winter night, but there was no fire, and the wind whistled through the broken panes. Upon a dirty and ill-kept bed lay a girl whose age it was difficult to guess. Her faded and sallow complexion and haggard features might have belonged to a woman of 30 years, but when she opened her eyes there was something in their childlike youthfulness of expression that indicated a girl not much past her first youth. I made an examination of her condition, and soon found that there was no hope of her recovery. She expressed no surprise when I gave my verdict, though her friend wept bitterly. "Don't cry, Annie," said the sick girl faintly. "God knows I'm glad to go. It's been very hard for me, and maybe the Lord will be better to me than man has been." The poor girl lingered for several days. I went to see her frequently, and little by little I won her confidence, and she told me her sad story. "I was not always as you see me now," she said. "Oh, my God, how long ago it seems since I was young and happy on the old New Hampshire farm. My father used to say I was like a sunbeam in the house. I was so light-hearted and gay. He never refused my slightest wish, except in one thing. I wanted to learn a trade so that I might have something to do in the world, just as if I had been a boy. Whenever I would talk to my father about this, he would pat me on the head as he would a child, and say that the work of the world must be done by the men, that girls must get married, and his Jessie should be no exception. And so it happened that, although I had a good education and as much natural capacity, perhaps, as any young man of my acquaintance, yet I had no thorough knowledge of anything that could serve me as a good resource in case of need. By the time I was 18 years old, both my parents were dead. It was found that my father was in debt, and there was nothing left for me. Thus I was forced to earn my own living. I came to the city full of high hopes. I was ambitious and determined not only to support myself, but to win name and place in the great world. But sir, I soon found that a woman has a hard battle to fight. It would sicken you to hear of all that I have been through. I commenced by answering an advertisement for cap makers. I, with 4 or 5 other girls, soon learned the trade, and we made quantities of caps. And then as soon as the work was done, and the rush over, the proprietor turned us all off without 1 cent of pay, as we were new hands. At last I secured a place in a store at $3 a week, and out of this I had to pay my lodging and board. I managed to live as long as my clothes held out. Then I began to suffer for the necessities of life, sir. I went without food for 2 days that I might buy a pair of shoes. My health gave way, living as I was without exercise, standing all day in a heated store, and sleeping in a cold room into which the sun never shone, and in which I was never able to light a fire. I grew pale and languid and unfit for my duties, and so I was not much surprised when at the end of a weary week a note was handed me from my employer, saying that he would have no further need of my services. I went to my room near to desperation. I saw nowhere to turn. I was friendless and alone. I went to the minister of the church I had attended, and he said he had so many calls he could not meet them all, but that he would take my address, and if he found anything for me to do, he would let me know. But in the meantime I was starving. Day after day I tried in vain to get employment. As I passed along the streets and looked with hungry eyes into the brilliantly lighted windows with their tempting array of fruits and eatables, bitter indeed were the thoughts that forced their way into my mind. I grew to doubt God himself, feeling as I did so keenly the inhumanity of his creatures. All this time, sir, before God, I never thought of turning to vice for a support. Not the daintiest girl in the world, nursed in luxury, surrounded by loving friends, would have been more horrified at a vicious thought than I. One day I went to a lawyer's office, trying to get some copying to do. There was a young man in the room who listened with some interest as I talked with the lawyer, and when I left the office he followed me, and very respectfully asked for my address, saying he might hear of some way to help me. I gave him my number in all innocence, and went my way with my heart somewhat lightened by the first words of sympathy I had heard. That very evening it seemed to me the climax of my sorrows was reached. I had not paid my lodging bill for some weeks, and for nearly 2 days I had not tasted food. My landlady was clamoring for her rent. I was standing before her weeping like any criminal, when the door opened and the young man entered whom I had seen that day in the lawyer's office. He comprehended at a glance the position of affairs, and coming to my side, confronted my landlady and asked what she meant by treating me in such a manner. "I want my pay," said she, "and I'm going to have it too, or my fine lady will be turned into the streets." The young man drew out his purse and paid her the amount of the bill, while I sank to the floor in an agony of shame. "Why, my dear girl," said he, "you must let me be your friend. Get your hat now, and come and take a walk with me." Well, sir, that was the beginning. It went on in that way for some time before he spoke of love to me and tried to persuade me to give myself to him. Oh, my God, think of it! He found me starving, cold, desolate, and alone. He offered me love, warmth, light, comfort. He swore by all that was holy to be true to me forever. What could I do? I tried to pray, but I guess God didn't hear my prayers, or he would have saved me. You can tell how it ended, sir, by my giving up to him the one dear possession that men take without remorse, when they had better put a knife to the poor girl's throat and drink her life's blood. For some time I was feverishly happy. My lover not only surrounded me with every material comfort, but he was so kind and tender as to win my whole heart. He told me it was not wrong in the sight of God for us to live as we did, that it was not necessary for a preacher to pronounce a form of words over us to make us man and wife, that nature and our hearts were our best guides. This sort of talk quieted me, and I tried to be happy. My lover thought me pretty, and delighted to buy beautiful articles of dress for me. He always wished to see my face in smiles, and could not conceal his impatience if I ever gave way to grief and tears. Things went on in this way for some months, until to my horror I discovered that I bore in my bosom that which would one day be a witness of my sin. No human being will ever know what I suffered when this knowledge came upon me. I had no loving mother to whom I might whisper my secret with grateful pride, no kind husband to share in my sacred joy at the first throb of that little heart. There was I alone, with no one of my own sex near me, my only companion a man who received the news I had to tell him with a muttered curse. And instead of those happy dreams for the future in which expectant young mothers usually indulge, the best I could pray for my child was that it might grow up without the knowledge of the mother whose sin it would blush to know. Many a time have I cast myself on the floor in agony and striven to utter a prayer for my baby, but in vain. It seemed to me that a black cloud was between me and heaven, and not a ray of light pierced through the darkness. A worse suffering was to come. My lover was bitterly opposed to my having a child, and proposed that I should destroy it. I repulsed the thought in indignation, and he then said that in such a case he could have nothing further to do with me. "If you have a child," said he, "I run too many risks of being compromised." And with that he left me. This man who had taken advantage of my helplessness and done me the most cruel wrong one mortal could do another. He left me because I would not consent to become a murderess to prevent his being compromised. This grief was too much for my physical endurance. I sank under it. My babe was born prematurely, and only lived long enough for me to feel the little aimless hands touch my bosom, the little loving lips touch mine, and I vowed in that moment to purify my life for my baby's sake. As soon as I was able, I resumed my search for employment, but again the conviction that I was one too many in the world was forced upon me. My every effort was frowned down by those to whom I would tell anything of my past life. I struggled along, however, and finally secured a place as seamstress in a wealthy family. Here I began to know a certain peace. I was well treated. I had told nothing of my story, knowing that to do so would secure my being turned out of the house. My employer was named Sedley, and I was engaged to assist in making the wedding clothes of Miss Grace, the oldest daughter. One day this young lady came into the room where I was sewing, dressed for a drive. She was detained longer than she expected, giving me directions, and a young man entered with the words, "Come, Grace, we shall be late for our drive." Sir, that man was Edward White, my seducer, the father of my child, now the engaged lover of Grace Sedley. I rose from my seat and involuntarily spoke his name. "What does this mean?" said Mrs. Sedley. "What does this girl know of you, Edward?" He turned to Miss Grace, saying pointedly, "Grace, will you leave the room a few moments?" She did so, and he turned to Mrs. Sedley. "This girl, madam, Jessie she called herself to me, I don't know what name she has given you, is a girl of bad character, a very unfit person to have in your house." "How do you know so much about her?" said Mrs. Sedley, smiling slightly. "My dear madam," he said, "when you consented to give me your daughter, I told you I had been no saint. My past life, I suppose, has been a little free like that of most other young men, but rest assured the purity of your daughter is a sufficient guarantee of my future. As for this person," and he pointed to me, "all I have to say is that the sooner she is out of your house the better." Here he left the room, and Mrs. Sedley turned to me with hard, cruel words. "Get out of my house, you shameless creature," she said, "and don't dare to apply to me for a character, or I shall tell everybody just what you are." I was too broken-spirited to attempt any reply, but from my soul I wondered what was the wide moral gulf between the oppressed, unhappy girl and the depraved man who had endeavored to make her nature as depraved as his own. Some weeks after that, I saw the bridal party move to the carriages. A velvet carpet was spread for her to walk upon. She was crowned with flowers and dressed in white. He looked as tender and careful of her as if she were too precious for the winds to blow upon. I watched them, I, the outcast, the degraded, the wretched. Oh God, was it to my blame and her credit that we both stood where we did? Or is there a dreadful wrong somewhere? There isn't much more to tell, sir. I had passed through so much that my health was all gone, I think. I would have starved but for Annie here. Poor Annie hadn't had much chance in life herself. She is what you'd call a bad girl. But if some of the good ones had been more like her, sir, I wouldn't have been the poor lost creature that I am. I am very glad to die, sir. I don't know what else there is for poor girls like me to do. Imagine, if you can, friends who read this story, the circumstances under which it was told, and the powerful effect it had upon me. It was not told connectedly, as I have given it, but brokenly, with gasps between the sentences and long pauses for rest. Comment upon such a story is almost needless. It speaks so loudly of the wrongs of a woman's life. The very angels might weep to think of poor Jessie in her New Hampshire home, as blithe and beautiful as a bird in the forest, and then look upon her, ragged, emaciated, and dying a miserable death in a city garret. And perhaps better than man, the angels will know how to judge of all such cases, and at whose door the sin really lies. The father teaching that marriage is a girl's only resource. The employer paying starvation wages. The man sacrificing a human soul to his brutal, selfish passion. The fine lady pushing a poor creature back to vice for a support by closing the door of an honest livelihood. These people all represent classes, and perhaps in the long run it will be found that they have more to answer for than the victims of their false and selfish systems. After my fourth visit to Jessie, I was unexpectedly called from home, and did not return for some days. I hastened to see her as soon as I got back. As I neared the place, I saw a wagon driving away from it with a plain deal coffin tumbled carelessly in it. The one mourner was a weeping girl whom I recognized as Annie. I joined her. She told me of the last hours of her friend. "Just before she died, sir," sobbed Annie, "she looked up at me with her face all shining and peaceful, and she said, 'Annie, I think my little baby has prayed for me, and maybe after all, God will forgive me, for it's been very hard.' What do you think, my reader?" Dr. Lewis relates a good many instances which have come under his observation, in which poverty has caused the ruin of innocent, pure-minded girls who had to choose between shame and starvation. They approached their doom almost unconsciously, taking the first steps innocently, the libertine coming to them with words of cheer and kindness, the first they had heard mayhap for many a long day. Is it a wonder that these poor creatures fall, or that, when every avenue of employment is closed to them, every honorable door is shut against them, they at last find their refuge in the house of shame, and plunge into the vortex of disease and death? This class of fallen women can easily be saved if the proper efforts are only made. There is not one of them who does not loathe and despise her terrible existence. Not one who would not in a moment exchange her life of gilded sin for one of honest, however humble, virtue. They are made courtesans because, in youth, under our present social system, they are not taught any useful trade or occupation by which to gain a livelihood when thrown upon their own resources. Because employers remorselessly take advantage of their necessities and compel them to work for a beggarly pittance which will hardly keep body and soul together, the whole world seems to be turned against them, and when they hear words of kindness and sympathy, spoken in the guise of friendship by the heartless libertine and seducer, is it any wonder that they listen and fall, only to be betrayed and abandoned? Then all efforts to rise are futile. If they tell the story of their lives, how many men and women, even among professors of religion, will open their doors to them and afford them an opportunity to support themselves by honest, humble industry, and to atone for the past by lives of purity and virtue? If they conceal their shame and strive to hide their sin, and thus succeed in securing employment, is exposure not almost inevitable? And then the proud lady of wealth and fashion gathers her skirts about her, as if fearing contamination, and drives the poor creature from her house into the streets, as in the case just related, cutting off from her reach every opportunity to save herself, and forcing her down into the depths of degradation from which she has vainly striven to escape. In a pleasant little village in northern Indiana about 5 years ago, there lived as happy a family as I ever knew, composed of father, mother, 3 daughters, and 3 sons. The father was in moderate circumstances, but being postmaster of the village was able to support his wife and children in decency and comfort, although not in luxury. In order to make some provision for them in the event of his death, he had his life insured for a goodly sum. About 4 years ago he was drowned, and the widow, who had thought her future secure, found to her great sorrow that the last payment had not been made on the policy of insurance, and that it had become forfeited only 2 or 3 days before the fatal accident. Left entirely without resources, with a large family to provide for, the good woman was almost desperate. Her daughters had all married mechanics of humble means. 2 of them were provided for, but were unable to assist her. The third, a young and beautiful girl, slender in figure, delicate in health, had wedded a dissipated, worthless cigar maker, who had heartlessly abandoned her just before her child was born, and left her to battle with the world and care for her babe, wholly without means. Of the 3 sons, 2 were little boys, and the third, who had attained the years of manhood, was idle, dissipated, and worthless, a curse rather than a blessing. Then began a prolonged struggle with starvation. The widowed mother, the worse than widowed daughter, and her infant child, with the 2 little boys, went to the city of my residence, and tried in every possible way to gain a subsistence. The mother, who was in feeble health, accepted any employment, however hard or distasteful. She scrubbed and washed and ironed and nursed the sick, and was forced by the wealthy and affluent to work night and day for the barest pittance. The young daughter and mother nursed and cared for her babe, and although delicate and broken in health, she toiled with her needle through the long days and late into the nights, working at the sewing machine until a hectic flush mounted her fair cheeks. Her sunken eyes shone with unnatural brilliancy, and sharp pains passed through her wasted body. And when she could get no sewing or fancy work to do, she too did washing and scrubbing and nursed the sick, and all for the most slender wages. Mother and daughter wasted away. Their health was shattered from exposure and labor, and lack of food, medicine, and clothing. All this time, this fair young girl, who in spite of poverty and sickness and labor, was still beautiful, was meeting with temptations to sacrifice her virtue. Libertines and seducers were on her track, but she repulsed them all and declared proudly that she would rather starve than accede to their wishes, rather die than surrender her virtue. But darker hours were yet to come. Her mother fell sick and was no longer able to toil. Her babe was ill and suffering for food and warm clothing and medical attendance and medicine. The rent of her humble quarters was due, and the family would be ejected if it were not paid. Her little brothers were ragged and hungry. It was midwinter, and she could get no work, and even had employment offered, she could hardly have accepted because of her delicate health and the demands of her sick mother and babe. Despair filled her soul, and in the presence of the suffering and privations of her loved ones, she determined to sacrifice herself for their sake. She sallied forth, resolved to sell her soul to whoever would buy it, and save, perhaps, her darling's life. Repeatedly since this girl's surrender has she tried to obtain honorable employment, but those who have dragged her down are determined to keep her in the depths, and she finds herself a shunned and dishonored creature. When I last saw her, the hectic flush of consumption was in her cheeks. The feverish glare of disease was in her eyes. Death had marked her for his own, and ere many months she will go to her grave, another victim to the coldness, the selfishness, the heartlessness of society. So far from being censured for her fall, she is rather to be commended for the brave and heroic resistance she made to the tempter. If she had a fault, it was that she was too proud to beg. But how many of her more fortunate sisters, who would feel themselves tainted by contact with her, could withstand the temptations she resisted so long, or preserve their virtue amidst such trials as this poor girl had to meet? Oh, it is a fearful thing, in this 19th century, this age of civilization, refinement, and Christianity, this period of general prosperity and plenty, that poverty should drive women, naturally pure and virtuous, to sell their souls for bread. The blood of these poor creatures is upon the skirts of society, and society must expect to reap the curse. The temptations which are thrown about poor women and girls in our cities and towns are terrible. The factory girls, the clerks, the milliners, the seamstresses in our great cities have to toil like slaves for the most beggarly wages. The hard labor to which they give their days scarcely suffices to procure for them the bare necessaries of life. They are compelled to dwell in humble apartments, to dress in scanty attire, to forego the pleasures and amusements of society, and to constantly see before them the luxury, the splendor, the wealth which the few enjoy. These girls are surrounded by all manner of temptations, and are offered every inducement to exchange their lives of honest, humble industry for gilded, luxurious vice. The road to perdition is a seductive and inviting one. Few, very few, begin to tread it, realizing where it leads, or expecting to suffer any harm. They find it easy for them to make male acquaintances, handsome, polished, well-dressed fellows, who invite them out for an evening's amusement. They find their existence dull and monotonous, and greedily accept the opportunity to have a little fun. Alas, the fun often proves very costly. They go to the theater, and their mind is poisoned by such pernicious plays as Camille and Madeleine Morel. They take a ride with some new-found acquaintance, and he pours into their ears words of deep meaning and terrible import. Next they are invited to an oyster supper, with gay companions and pleasant surroundings. Perhaps they are induced to put the wine-cup to their lips, and under its influence to commit improprieties which would have shocked them before they entered upon the pursuit of pleasure. The next step in their downward career, and they visit the public dance halls, those stepping stones to hell, which abound in the metropolitan cities, over whose portals should be placed Dante's dread inscription, "Who enters here leaves hope behind." So it is that thousands of working girls in our cities enter innocently and unsuspectingly into the paths which lead them to the houses of evil, or to wander the streets, miserable outcasts, doomed to a wretched existence and a premature death. How true the words of the poet: "Vice is a monster of such hideous mien, that to be baited needs but to be seen. Yet seen too oft, familiar with his face, we first endure, then pity, then embrace." The theater, the drive, the oyster supper, the dance hall, these are the milestones which mark the working girl's journey from virtue to vice, from modesty to shame. The gay fellow who has lavished his attentions upon her and afforded her a taste of the world's pleasure, to which she had before been a stranger, finally effects her ruin. She is duly installed as his mistress, but in time he abandons her to go in quest of other game. Thus deserted, her conscience burdened with the knowledge of her sin, her mind tainted and sullied by the experience she has had, she loses her pride in her work and finds herself possessed of an aversion for humble labor. In 99 cases out of 100 her moral descent is rapid from this time forward, and a few years finds her the depraved and degraded inmate of a brothel, the vile creature of the pave, the occupant of a prison cell, an almshouse, or an insane asylum, or perhaps the tenant of a suicide's grave. The saleswoman, the seamstress, the factory girl had better, far better, die than take the first step in the path which I have just described. Better, 1,000 times better, better for this life, better for the life to come, an existence of humble, virtuous industry, than a single departure from virtue, even though it were paid with a fortune. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Save the Girls by Mason Long. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Some temptations of city life, the theater, the racecourse, street flirtations, etc. One of the fruitful causes of prostitution is the love of dress, which in the breasts of so many women is the overpowering passion, and which leads such multitudes of them into careers of infamy. Many foolish girls have been led by this passion to sell their virtue for gold in order to possess the means of bedecking their bodies with gorgeous raiment. These silly creatures envy the gaily, flashily dressed courtesan whom they pass on the street, and imagine that she is happy because of her magnificent apparel. How little they realize what awful misery is disguised by her silks and velvets. Of course, those who can ascribe their fall to a love of dress do not possess those strong virtuous instincts which would protect them against these temptations to unchastity. Many of them are girls of great personal beauty and moderate intellect. They are born of humble parents, reared in a modest, simple way, and do not possess the means of gratifying their taste for personal adornment. Large numbers of them are raised on the farm, or in some quiet, unpretentious country town or village. They see about them those who can afford to dress elegantly, and they morbidly contrast their own slender purses with those of their neighbors. At the village dance they find their shabby attire contrasting unfavorably with the dresses of other guests. By and by they drift to the city. Perhaps they go out to service or to clerk or sew, or perhaps with the false ideas of feminine independence which prevail, they remain at home without useful employment, a burden upon an overworked, underpaid father. They catch a glimpse of rich dressing at the theater, on the streets, in the great storehouses of fashion, in the elegant carriages which roll past them. By and by they come to regard dress as the chief aim and object of woman's existence, and to possess the means to gratify this passion they are ready to exchange their dearest treasure, that most priceless jewel, their virtue. Then the tempter comes along and finds an easy victim, and the sad story ends in the house of shame. Many wives of men of moderate means, clerks, mechanics, engineers, and men of all kinds, who receive wages sufficient to support themselves and their families in comfort, but not in luxury, have proved false to the men whose names they bore, unfaithful to the sacred vows they took at the marriage altar, and abandoned home and children in order to obtain the money with which to dress richly and extravagantly, and to gain access to gay worldly society. A few weeks ago, American circles in Paris were shocked beyond measure at the suicide of Mrs. Annie Wetmore, who had become famous in the frivolous circles of the gay French capital for her rare beauty of face and figure, her handsome dressing, and her social indiscretions. Her career was a romantic one, and carries a moral which should be heeded by those foolish women who are not satisfied with the love of a poor husband, who find virtue in a cottage to be monotonous, and who barter their souls and sacrifice their eternal welfare in order that they may enjoy a few short years of life amid the gilded trappings of vice and luxury. Her story can soon be told. Some 15 years ago her ambition to shine in social life, coupled with the beauty of her person and her natural sprightliness and vivacity, secured her an easy admittance to the gay society of New York. Dazzled by social successes, by the flattery of numerous admirers, and the glitter of a gay life, for which her early education and surroundings had not prepared her, she lost all taste for the duties of her proper sphere as the wife of a poor but worthy clerk in the New York Custom House, became estranged from her husband, and finally abandoned her home and crossed the ocean to become the victim of a social tragedy. The people who knew her well say that the motives which have guided her career for the past 12 years led naturally step by step to the bitter denouement. Many of the residents of Stratford, Connecticut, where the unfortunate woman passed her girlhood, remember her as a maiden of rare attractions. She was the daughter of William C. Doherty, a commission merchant in that city. She was a tall and slender brunette with lovely and expressive features, exceedingly graceful in bearing, vivacious in manner, and sparkling in conversation. Among her many wooers was a gentleman who has since become very wealthy in New York, and who still lives a bachelor. Some 22 years ago, when she was 19 years of age, she was married to William Wetmore, son of the president of the New York Juvenile Asylum. The fathers of the young couple were both in moderate circumstances, but by combining the funds they had set apart for a wedding present, they were able to present Mrs. Wetmore with a comfortable cottage. Young Wetmore was just entering business life as a poorly paid clerk in the custom house. His salary was barely sufficient to provide the necessities of life, and for several years the young people were partly dependent upon the generosity of the elder Mr. Wetmore. The young wife, her friends say, early became discontented with the meagerness and poverty of her home. She often upbraided herself with her folly in marrying a poor man, and their straitened circumstances were the primal cause of the coldness that grew up between husband and wife. Mr. Wetmore, moreover, was a professor of religion, had little or no sympathy with the social ambitions of his wife, and wished her to go to religious meetings when she much preferred more sparkling and gayer society. He desired, besides, to practice economy, and by perseverance and self-denial to make his way, while his wife was extravagant in her tastes and had no sympathy with her husband's aims. After some 7 years of unhappy married life, spent in comparative seclusion, Mrs. Wetmore blossomed easily and speedily into a more congenial sort of existence as a society belle. Her circle of society friends were by no means the most exclusive and aristocratic set in New York, but they were a gay lot, wealthy and pretentious, figured in all the leading events of the fashionable season, and were altogether congenial to the tastes of Mrs. Wetmore. She was intoxicated with the homage done her beauty and gay social qualities. She was one of the pets of the social circle which claimed her, was in great demand at all the routs and dances of the season, contrived to dress in accordance with the demands of her social position, and encountered any number of admirers, the devotion of some of whom was unmistakable. This sort of life led her so completely away from her husband and home that the couple finally separated very quietly. Their paths thereafter led entirely apart. Wetmore came west to take a position on a railroad, and Mrs. Wetmore, 12 years ago, crossed the ocean alone and in an adventurous spirit in quest of new social worlds to conquer. She was then about 30 years old and in the prime of her charms. She has since lived in London and Paris, where she has been well known to the American colonies in those cities. She made considerable impression in some of the gay circles of London, and of late years has spent most of her time in the French capital. About 4 years ago she returned to America for a short visit, but was not content to remain long away from the gayer life of Paris. She was particularly proud of her list of titled acquaintances, and the society to which she was admitted abroad was largely that in which the younger scions of noble houses were the bright particular lights. It was while leading this butterfly life, wholly devoted to society, its conquests and its pleasures, that Mrs. Wetmore, about 3 years ago, first met the Marquis of Anglesey, then Lord Henry Paget, who, with the well-known susceptibility of the Anglesey family, became very much infatuated with the lovely American. The Marquis is one of the handsomest men in England, and his devotion to Mrs. Wetmore was by her sincerely encouraged. It is said that she was not tempted merely by his title, but that she passionately loved the man. She told some of her intimate friends 2 years ago that nothing but the hateful tie which still bound her to William Wetmore prevented her from being the wife of Henry Paget. If this was true, it was woefully unfortunate for her future that the obstacle of her former marriage stood in her way. For being unable to legalize their intimacy, Mrs. Wetmore, it is stated, became the mistress of the Marquis of Anglesey, and lived in splendid apartments in the same building which he occupied. The relations between the two were very well understood by their friends, but whether there was between them an engagement of marriage to be consummated when Mrs. Wetmore had thrown off the yoke she bore, seems in the minds of her New York friends to be involved in doubt. They say, however, that she hoped for an honorable alliance with the Marquis, and they think she believed she would one day be his wife. She learned with pleasure 2 years ago that her husband had begun a suit for divorce on the grounds of desertion. He obtained a decree. Her father, who has since died, wrote her that, if she desired, he could have the decree set aside because she had not been notified of the suit. She replied that she was more than satisfied with the course affairs had taken. She could not, however, retain her supremacy over the Marquis. The members of the Anglesey family have always been great gallants, and have never been noted for constancy in their love affairs. The intrusion of the Honourable Mrs. Woodhouse, née King, of Georgia, into the affections which Mrs. Wetmore had held, drove the unfortunate woman to despair, and she ended her life with poison. In Mrs. Wetmore's own words, "My fate should be a warning to American women who come abroad without their legitimate protectors." The sad fate of this gifted and beautiful woman should certainly be a terrible warning to every one of her sex who allows a love of dress and gay society to dazzle her senses, blind her judgment, and obliterate in her mind the great distinctions between right and wrong. Too often weak parents encourage a love for dress in their daughters, and the consequences are frequently of the most terrible nature. Dr. D.O. Lewis tells how 3 sisters were wrecked by this dangerous passion, which their parents fostered and nurtured. The story is a brief one, and is so appropriate that I cannot forbear quoting it in full. Mr. S. had 6 daughters, and they had the misfortune to be pretty. As they grew up, the clothes question became perplexing. The father could feed his large family, but not much more. Everybody said that if they could be handsomely dressed, they would be the most attractive young ladies in the country. It was a pity that they could not be fixed up in style. The girls clamored for something decent to wear. They were too beautiful to go out to service, too ignorant to teach anything, and too proud to learn trades, as boys would have done. There seemed nothing left but marriage. They displayed their remarkable charms. Their father staggered under the load, and these beautiful young creatures, without trade or profession, were compelled to bring every attraction to the counter. At length Mary, who was understood to be engaged to a young man of means, suddenly appeared with a silk dress and a gold watch. Her lover invited her to accompany him to New York to see his mother, and to stay with her a few months, that the family might become acquainted with her. Later, the older sister was invited to visit Mary, who was still staying with her future mother-in-law. Susan went, solemnly charged by her mother to write all about Mary's friends, and to let them know when Mary was coming home to be married. In due time the letter came, full of disappointment and dark hints. Susan promised to return home at once. The next letter did not arrive under a fortnight, but when it did come it was full of delight with the city and all its wonderful sights. A varying correspondence was kept up between the family and their daughters in New York. When at length the girls came home visiting, they were splendidly dressed. The girls told us that Mary's future mother-in-law had a brother who had brought oceans of money from the East Indies, and thought all the world of them, and gave them everything they wanted. At the end of a week the girls returned to New York. They had hardly reached the city before their father, who had followed them, walked into their city home. He knew but little of the world, but he was not long in finding out the character of the house where his daughters were stopping. In a long and painful interview they confessed all, but refused to return home. In the city they could go to the theater, and their friends gave them everything that heart could wish. The father pleaded with tears and heartbreaking sobs, but they could not think of going back. The father threatened and started out for an officer. When he returned, the girls were gone, and after staying about for 2 or 3 days, he came back home, bringing sorrow and shame to his household. Libertines soon began to call on the other girls. The parents, after anxious consultation with the minister and other friends, resolved to take their family to Wisconsin. After some weeks of preparation, consisting in part of the sale of household furniture to secure the needed funds, the tickets were purchased, and on a certain Monday we gathered at the depot to see them off. But where was Nelly? She was the fourth daughter, and the most beautiful creature I ever saw. We ran hither and thither, but she could not be found. While all were wild, a young man came hurrying into the station who had met her driving away as fast as horses could fly with Captain D, a dissipated man of 40, well known in the neighborhood. The train came and went, and the crushed parent sat in a corner unable to move or speak. They returned to the house of a friend, where they remained 2 or 3 days, hoping to hear from Nelly. A letter came from her, not to the family, but to a girl in the village. She wrote in the happiest temper, said she was to be married to a nice man, very rich, and was then going abroad. The captain swapped girls with a friend of his within a month, and Nelly soon went to New York. Then we lost sight of the family. About 2 years afterward, Susan, the second girl, came back to our village, but oh, how changed! She was far gone in consumption, and confessed to our village minister that drink and the birth of a baby had killed her. She brought sad news from beautiful Nelly, whose dissipated career was rapidly shortening her days. The oldest sister had married a gambler, and had been traded 4 times for the wives of other gamblers. She was fading, and had contracted a disease which had injured her voice. New York consumes several thousand girls in this way every year. Dr. Lewis, whose views upon this subject are certainly entitled to great weight, thinks that the social evil can be reduced to small dimensions and eventually cured if girls will only learn remunerative trades as boys do. The number of those who pursue a life of shame because they like it is comparatively insignificant. But young girls thrown upon their own resources find themselves unable to supply their natural wants. 100 men stand ready to fill their treasury to overflowing if they will only consent. That 10 girls do not lapse where one goes astray is a triumphant proof of their innate chastity. Dr. Lewis wonders why more country girls who go to cities do not prefer the free, independent, healthful life of domestic service to the hard, ill-paid, unwholesome labors of sewing or clerking. He adds, "What must be thought of the moral sense of these New England girls when it is truthfully stated that for one who leaves the position of sewing girl for the care of a kitchen, 10 leaves to serve as kept mistresses? I have not known of a single one who, with a true appreciation of the advantages, has chosen the kitchen, while I have known a number who have deliberately chosen to respond to the vile advertisements which appear daily in one of our papers under the head of personal. Those who allow themselves to sacrifice their virtue to gratify a love of dress and gay society are not entitled to the sympathy which we should accord to their erring sisters who have been driven to lives of infamy by grinding poverty, or have fallen from their high estate through the devilish machinations of the libertine. But at the same time I cannot refrain from asking the question, hasn't society a great deal to do with the ruin of these foolish women? Doesn't society encourage all manner of extravagance in dress? Doesn't society prompt people of humble means to attempt a ruinous rivalry with their neighbors who possess longer purses? Doesn't society uphold the employer who discriminates so severely against women in the payment of wages? Doesn't society teach that certain occupations in which thousands of poor women could gain a decent and honorable livelihood are not respectable? All these questions, I fear, can only be truthfully answered in the affirmative. I will here take occasion to briefly refer to some frequent causes of women's ruin, other than those I have written of in this volume. Many women have been led astray through the influence of the theater. The stage is seductive and inviting, and young women cannot guard themselves too strongly against its allurements. The drama is corrupt beyond measure, and there seems little hope for its purification. There are very few pure plays on the stage, and they do not prove popular. Most of the successful plays of the present day are in the highest degree immoral. The heroes and heroines are vile characters, and the plots are so skillfully arranged as to gain for them the sympathy of the audiences. The incidents are demoralizing, the language is impure and unchaste. The operas are even worse than the plays. But in both the indecent display of the female form is made one of the chief attractions. The burlesques and ballets and spectacles which are now all the rage are worse than either play or opera. They are essentially indecent and degrading and should not be tolerated. Pure-minded young women cannot attend the theater without contamination. There they imbibe false ideas of life, of society and religion, which prepare their minds to succumb to the temptations of the seducer. They listen to coarse, vulgar language, which at first brings the crimson blush to their maiden cheeks, but with which they finally become familiarized. They see immodest exhibitions of the feminine person, and watch the development of vulgar and sensational plots. At the theater, too, they are thrown among worldly people, and too often it is followed by the oyster supper, the wine glass, the dance house, and finally the fall from virtue. Alas, how many fallen creatures can date their ruin from their first visit to the theater! Although the stage is sustained and patronized by many professing Christians, its influence is none the less pernicious and demoralizing for all that. In fact, it is thus only rendered more fascinating, and hence more dangerous by the countenance it receives from such people, and I cannot forbear raising my voice against it, and warning young women who desire to remain spotless and blameless from visiting it. It has in the past led many of their sisters into the pathway of shame, and is still performing that dreadful work. It has become very fashionable in our large cities for ladies to attend horse races. Many women who are active in the churches go to such affairs, and take with them their daughters. In this they do a great wrong, and oftentimes the consequences are terrible. They countenance by their presence such degrading vices as drunkenness and gambling. They breathe an atmosphere at the racetrack which no pure woman should inhale. Their ears are oftentimes saluted with the most frightful profanity and blasphemy, the most shocking vulgarity and obscenity. They are in the presence of gamblers, saloon keepers, seducers, libertines, and in fact all the fast men in the community. Those who would have their wives and daughters and sisters live pure, chaste, virtuous lives should keep them away from the racetrack, for it is the scene of all kinds of temptations, and its effect is demoralizing and brutalizing in the highest degree. Many promising young girls have been led astray by smooth-tongued, fascinating strangers with whom they have become acquainted on the cars, or by handkerchief flirtations on the streets, or by answering personal advertisements in the newspapers. No young woman should ever make the acquaintance of any man by these means. The men who introduce themselves to girls on the cars, who wave handkerchiefs at them in the streets, who insert personal advertisements in the newspapers, mean evil and nothing but evil. No young woman who desires to retain her chastity, her virtue, her self-respect, will notice them for a moment. Thousands of miserable outcasts have been brought down to their present level because when thoughtless maidens, perhaps innocent schoolgirls, they engaged in street flirtations or opened correspondence with strangers who advertised in the newspapers. Let a young woman be observed using her handkerchief in a street flirtation, and her reputation will never again be what it has been. Her name will not be spoken by the young men and boys about town with respect, but it will become the subject of jest and ribaldry. All the temptations I have spoken of in this chapter are snares laid by wicked men for the purpose of entrapping innocent young girls. They should shun these pitfalls as they would the serpent's bite. and parents who desire to save their daughters from a fate which is worse than death should endeavor by every means in their power to keep them from falling into the traps thus cunningly devised for them. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Save the Girls by Mason Long. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The life of a fallen queen, from a palace to an alley, and then to an insane asylum. Of all human beings, the professional prostitute is certainly the most miserable and wretched. Her life is a living death, whose horrors it would require an abler pen than mine to portray. Whether she be the inmate of the gilded palace of sin with its rich oriental carpets, its luxurious tapestries and upholstery, its frescoed walls and ceilings, its costly chandeliers and stately mirrors and ravishing pictures, or whether in an humbler abode she sells her soul and body for paltry pelf, and sins and suffers amidst the accompaniments of penury and want, or whether in the last stages of her hopeless existence even the miserable boon of this humble abode is denied her, and she wanders up and down the streets and alleys in rags and hunger, craving food and drink, or the stupefying drugs with which she is wont to dull her whetted senses and bring rest to her jaded form. Whether in the prison cell or the madhouse, or shuddering upon the bank of the deep cold river into which she is about to make the final plunge, the fallen woman is the most wretched, the most miserable, the most degraded of all God's creatures. Her home, if she has one, is a charnel house full of woe. Her body is racked with the pains and the torments which are as sure to follow a life of dissipation and debauchery as night is to succeed day. Her conscience, long blunted and warped and seared by her life of degradation, is occasionally awakened to torture her with its reproaches and embitter her life with premonitions of the terrible eternity of blackness and woe toward which she is rapidly and surely drifting. Her mind is filled with remorse over her past life and a horrible dread of the future. Hating herself, she is loathed and despised by others. Most women, after they have chosen a vicious life, fall to even a lower depth than is ever reached by the most degraded men. They plunge into the wildest excesses, are guilty of the most terrible blasphemy and obscenity, pride themselves on their shocking wantonness and recklessness, which are ofttimes exhibited with a brazenness and bravado that make even the most hardened and depraved of their male associates shudder. After a woman has crossed the line, she in a majority of instances cherishes for a time the hope of reform, and keeps herself within some limits of outward decency and decorum. So long as that hope remains, she is careful to stoop no lower than compelled to by her dreadful calling. But let that hope be once taken away, let her once imbibe the idea that there is no chance for her in this life, and no salvation for her in the life to come, and she throws aside all restraint and plunges as deep into the vortex of vice and shame as it is possible for a human being to go. It is said by those who have made the most patient and thorough investigations into the social evil in our large cities that, in most instances, the women who reach the very lowest stages of depravity are those who have fallen from the highest pinnacles of modesty and virtue. The reason for this is obvious. The women who have been reared in an atmosphere of vice and profligacy enter upon their wretched careers at an early age, when they are already so calloused to sin that they escape those awful reproaches of conscience, those terrible pangs of remorse, those harrowing recollections of the past which crowd the brains of those who have enjoyed the happiness of a pure and refined home, who have possessed the love of father and mother, of brother and sister, who have known and experienced the sweet delights of a life of modesty and chastity, and the surroundings of refinement, affection, and religion. Hence the latter, when once convinced that their cases are hopeless, try to hush their consciences and drown their sorrows by delving into a mad whirlpool of revelry and dissipation. They seek relief from their torturing thoughts and lacerating recollections of the past in the bottle. When the bottle fails, morphine and opium are brought into requisition, until at last their constitutions, hopelessly shattered by the severe strain put upon them by their heated, feverish, unnatural lives, succumb, and they become inmates of a madhouse or a hospital, and ere long fill a nameless and dishonored grave. Or if perchance life survives health and reason, they themselves seek the solace of the tomb, and with poison or a pistol end their terrible careers. Or mayhap the dark, silent waters of some great river receive their wasted bodies and blot out the lives that nature had intended for ornaments to society and honors to their sex. The average life of a fallen woman is but 7 years, but what an eternity of woe and wretchedness is not comprised within them! The elegant houses, the costly dresses, the splendid carriages, the fragrant wines in which the most fortunate of these women revel for a year or two, are only so many reminders of their degradation, so many witnesses to their loss of everything that makes life precious to a woman. The assumed enjoyments and pleasures of these creatures, which have dazzled and misled so many young people of both sexes, are the reverse of real. They seek self-forgetfulness at the theater, on the race-track, and at other resorts much frequented by their kind. But the oblivion which they crave never comes in this world, save it is brought by the wine-cup or the narcotic. One day, as I was passing along a Chicago street, I overheard 2 young girls, modest and ladylike in appearance, discussing the handsome dress and splendid carriage of a queen of the demi-monde, who was just passing by. One of the girls, thoughtless and frivolous, actually envied the outcast in her velvets and diamonds, and lamented that she too could not enjoy such luxury without work. Alas, poor ignorant girl! You knew not what you said. Better, 1,000 times better, that you be clothed in rags all the days of your life, that you toil for a beggarly pittance until life shall end. Better, 1,000 times better, that you do all this, than that you purchase diamonds and velvets and carriages at the fearful price paid by the lost woman whom you have just been envying. The horrors of the house of shame can only be hinted at in such a work as mine. Within those walls are enacted scenes which cannot be described or even imagined, but which prove to what depths of bestiality and degradation lost human nature can sink. The story of Blanche Bennet, which has been told in nearly every newspaper in the country, is a strikingly correct picture of the lives of many, many thousands of the fallen sisterhood. Blanche Bennet, like so many of her class, is now waiting the end, an inmate in an insane hospital. She was found recently in a St. Louis alley, surrounded by negroes, and to the policeman who deemed it his duty to remove her to a place of safety, she said that her name was Mary Miraculous. No one could have recognized in the wretchedly clad, unwashed, stolid, stupid-looking maniac in her prison cell the young woman who, 10 years ago, was a belle in Cincinnati. Her father was known as the Prince of Insurance Men, was reputed to be worth $1,000,000, and lived with his family in Clifton, the world-famed suburb of the Queen City. The fetes given at Bennet Palace were events to be remembered for years. The father dearly loved the girl and spared no expense upon her education, sending her to a fashionable convent, from which she emerged a highly finished young woman. She was an expert French scholar, a fine singer of very pleasing address, and the life of the social gatherings at her father's palace. Cincinnati was startled one morning by a rare scandal. Blanche Bennet had eloped with a young man named Fraser, who was penniless and without valuable social connection. The young couple went to Chicago. They did not live happily, and in less than 3 months Chicago was regaled with the racy details of a divorce suit. Blanche was very pretty at this time, and after the divorce was obtained she found no difficulty in securing a large number of sympathizing male friends. She drifted to St. Louis when in the very heyday of her womanhood, and became at once the sensation in the world in which she chose to move. A well-known saloon-keeper in that city took her from a house of ill fame and supported her in princely style for a long time. But her false and feeble nature led her to be untrue to this man, and she became the mistress of a young man of fortune and sporting proclivities. At this period in her life she began to drink heavily and to take morphine. Her mind, one of the brightest of the bright, became unsteady, and she attempted suicide one day. Her friend had her removed to the insane asylum. When released, she made her way straight to this young man, and after making an attempt upon his life, shot herself in the breast in his presence. After that, her decline was rapid. Her mind grew cloudier day by day. Her wardrobe, once worthy of a princess, was replaced by the cast-off clothing of negroes, and she has walked through the streets of St. Louis, the most miserable and pitiable of wrecks. People who knew her years ago have passed her on the street without dreaming of her identity. Shortly after her elopement, her father met with financial reverses and was utterly ruined. Then the world openly talked about what it had suspected for a long time, and that was that the mother of the girl, a glorious-looking blonde, was untrue to her husband, and had been long carrying on a liaison with a celebrated minstrel performer. The family dropped out of Cincinnati history. The mother located in Chicago and openly went to the bad. A son, quite a young man of great promise, became the companion of dissolute characters, and in 1876 was locked up in jail for stealing the clothing of a friend who had given him shelter, and was not permitted to attend the funeral of his mother, who was buried at the expense of the women of the town. The gray-haired, broken-hearted father is now occupying a minor position in connection with the Western agency of a great insurance company, which he once fairly controlled. A sadder story than the above was never put in type, and yet there are thousands of Blanche Bennets throughout the land who have fallen from the high position of queens of society to become creatures of the gutter and the street. In James W. Watson's familiar poem, Beautiful Snow, are 3 stanzas which are supposed to be uttered by such an one as poor Blanche Bennet. Once I was pure as the snow, but I fell like the snowflakes from heaven to hell, fell to be tramped as the filth of the street, fell to be scoffed, to be spit on and beat, pleading, cursing, dreading to die, selling my soul to whoever would buy, dealing in shame for a morsel of bread, hating the living and fearing the dead. Merciful God, have I fallen so low? And yet I was once like this beautiful snow. Once I was fair as the beautiful snow, with an eye like its crystals, a heart like its glow. Once I was loved for my innocent grace, flattered and sought for the charms of my face. Father, mother, sisters, all, God and myself, I have lost by my fall. The veriest wretch that goes shivering by will take a wide sweep, lest I wander too nigh. For all that is on or about me, I know There is nothing that's pure but the beautiful snow. How strange it should be that this beautiful snow should fall on a sinner with nowhere to go. How strange it would be, when the night comes again, if the snow and the ice struck my desperate brain, fainting, freezing, dying alone, too wicked for prayer, too weak for my moan to be heard in the crash of the crazy town, gone mad in its joy at the snow's coming down, to lie and to die in my terrible woe, with a bed and a shroud of the beautiful snow. Surely there is not one redeeming feature in the life of a courtesan from the moment she commits her first sin until the grave receives her wasted form, not one moment that the mind delights to linger upon, not one hour that the wretched creature, as she is standing upon the banks of the river, preparing to seek rest in a watery grave, can look back upon with satisfaction or contentment. Ah, if she has grievously sinned, so has she bitterly suffered. And I cannot close this chapter better than by quoting Tom Hood's immortal poem, The Bridge of Sighs. The most touching, pathetic, and powerful appeal to the world for charity to the lost sisterhood ever penned by man. The Bridge of Sighs. Drowned, drowned. Hamlet. One more unfortunate, weary of breath, rashly importunate, gone to her death. Take her up tenderly, lift her with care, fashioned so slenderly, young and so fair. Look at her garments, clinging like cerements, whilst the wave constantly drips from her clothing. Take her up instantly, loving, not loathing. Touch her not scornfully, think of her mournfully, gently and humanly, not of the stains of her, all that remains of her now is pure womanly. Make no deep scrutiny into her mutiny, rash and undutiful, past all dishonor. Death has left on her only the beautiful. Still, for all slips of hers, one of Eve's family, wipe those poor lips of hers, oozing so clammily. Loop up her tresses, escaped from the comb, her fair auburn tresses, whilst wonderment guesses where was her home. Who was her father? Who was her mother? Had she a sister? Had she a brother? Or was there a dearer one still, and a nearer one yet than all other? Alas for the rarity of Christian charity under the sun! Oh, it was pitiful, near a whole cityful, whom she had none. Sisterly, brotherly, fatherly, motherly feelings had changed, love by harsh evidence thrown from its eminence, even God's providence seeming estranged. Where the lamps quiver so far in the river, with many a light from window and casement, from garret to basement, she stood with amazement, houseless by night. The bleak wind of March made her tremble and shiver, but not the dark arch of the black flowing river. Mad from life's history, glad to death's mystery, swift to be hurled anywhere, anywhere out of the world. In she plunged boldly, no matter how coldly the rough river ran. Over the brink of it, picture it, think of it, dissolute man. Lave in it, drink of it, then, if you can. Take her up tenderly, lift her with care, fashioned so slenderly, young and so fair. Ere her limbs rigidly stiffen to rigidly, decently, kindly, smooth and compose them, and her eyes close them, staring so blindly, dreadfully staring, through muddy impurity, as when with the daring last look of despairing, fixed on futurity. Perishing gloomily, spurned by contumely, cold inhumanity, burning insanity, into her rest, cross her hands humbly, as if praying dumbly over her breast, owning her weakness, her evil behavior, and leaving with meekness her sins to her Savior. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Save the Girls by Mason Long. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Society buying a slave. The fate of the outcast. Fashionable immorality. Marital infidelity. A harp for the Magdalens. Among the characters in Victor Hugo's great novel Les Miserables is a poor outcast named Fantine, who was driven by poverty and suffering to sell herself to a life of shame. Hugo's picture of her hapless condition is most thrilling, and his indictment of society for her ruin is scathing. I quote, "What is this story of Fantine? It is society buying a slave. Of whom? Of misery, of hunger, of cold, of isolation, of abandonment, of privation. Sorrowful bargain, a soul for a morsel of bread. Misery offers, society accepts. The holy law of Jesus Christ governs our civilization, but it does not yet penetrate it. We say that slavery has disappeared from European civilization. This is an error. Slavery exists continually, but it weighs now only upon woman, and it is called prostitution. It weighs upon woman, that is to say, upon weakness, upon beauty, upon maternity. This is not one of the least reproaches upon man. At the point of this painful drama to which we have arrived, nothing any longer remains to Fantine of what she was formerly. She has become marble in becoming base. Whoever comes in contact with her is chilled. She passes, she endures you, and she ignores you. She has a harsh and dishonored face. Life and social order have said their last word to her. All that can happen to her has happened. She has felt all, endured all, experienced all, suffered all, lost all, wept all. She is resigned with that resignation which resembles indifference as death resembles sleep. She no longer shuns anything. She no longer fears anything. Fall upon her all the clouds, and roll over her all the ocean. What matters it to her? The sponge is saturated. She thinks so at least, but it is a mistake to imagine that one has drained the cup of fate or sounded the depths of any human contingency. Alas, what are all these destinies thus confusedly driven onward? Whither are they going? Wherefore are they so? He who knows that sees through all shadows. He is alone. His name is God. Victor Hugo presents the woman of sin to us in a state of utter and abject despair. She is indifferent as to what this world or the next has in store for her, for in Hugo's expressive words, all that can happen to her has happened. Such at least is her belief, and it is a belief which society has impressed upon her mind by its treatment of her. Public sentiment has regarded her as hopelessly degraded and irreclaimably lost, and because it has so regarded her, she has, perhaps, become so in reality. But had there been a different tone of public feeling, an ardent belief in the possibility of her reformation and salvation, her case might have been, and probably would have been, more hopeful. Society said to Fantine, "Starve or sin." She sinned, and then society said, "You have sinned, you have crossed the line of virtue, you have deliberately enrolled yourself among the votaries of vice. You have chosen to subsist upon the wages of shame. Henceforward and forever, you are an outcast. Your portion is naught but misery in this world as well as in the world to come. There is no hope for you in this life, none in the life which is beyond the tomb. that this is the attitude of society, this the tone of public sentiment toward fallen woman, none can truthfully deny. It can only be changed by bold, persistent, resolute, unyielding agitation, by open and fearless discussion by the pulpit, by the press, on the rostrums, in books and magazines and tracts. Individual effort is what is needed, and it can accomplish a great deal. The great truth that purity and chastity are as obligatory upon man as upon woman must be kept prominent. The fact that the Lord lays his injunctions in regard to the sin of lust equally upon both sexes must be constantly brought to the attention of the world. The man who commits adultery is just as guilty in the eyes of the Lord as the woman who sins with him, and frequently more so. However public sentiment may look at the matter, if justice were done in this world, every lewd man would be held to the same strict accountability that the lewd woman is. Society would insist that the groom be as pure as the bride, that the husband be as faithful as the wife, that the man who visits a house of shame be just as infamous as the woman who dwells there. It is a startling fact, and one that may well cause us to tremble for the future of our country, that the palaces of sin which abound in our great cities, and wherein dwell the slaves of whom Hugo tells us, are largely maintained by men who occupy prominent positions in society, in politics, in business, and in the learned professions. It is notorious that in our cities and towns, judges, bankers, merchants, railroad officials, leaders in all departments of human effort, the men who direct and control the material interests of the country, are, many of them, patrons of the frail sisters whom they pass upon the street with averted gaze, as if fearing contamination if they but touched the garments of those fallen creatures. It is stated by those who ought to know that more than 2/3 of the patrons of the houses of shame in New York and Washington are men of family, husbands and fathers, middle-aged and old men, men who are regarded by society as bright and shining lights. Truly, when those who should be the moral guides of the community go astray, when those who should aim to spread virtue and purity through the land help to maintain the greatest evil of the day, it is time that the note of warning be sounded from every possible quarter. Immoral men make our laws in the halls of Congress and in state legislatures. Immoral men are charged with the execution of them, both in federal and state governments. Men of the loosest character are at the head of many of our great corporations, such as banks, railroad and steamship companies, etc. Many of our merchant princes, our great manufacturers, and our bonanza kings are notorious for their personal profligacy and almost open licentiousness. But for the class of men I have named, the men of power, of wealth, of position, of education, 2/3 of our houses of shame would be closed from lack of support. If these men were true to themselves, faithful to the great trusts reposed in them, loyal to their wives, dutiful towards their families, mindful of their religious and moral obligations, the number of society's slaves would be reduced at least 1/2. It is a great error, although a common one, to suppose that the social evil is supported mainly by the so-called criminal classes, or by those who make no pretensions to decency or respectability. Such is not the case. On the contrary, it is, as I have said, that the men to whom we should naturally look for better things are the main support and dependence of the vast army of fallen women, whose sad condition has excited our commiseration. In this connection I feel that a word should be said touching the shameful loosening of marital obligations in so-called fashionable society, not only in this country, but in England and in the countries of continental Europe. Royalty itself has set a frightful example of open licentiousness by husbands and fathers, and the nobility has not been slow to imitate the example of those who hover near the throne. The story of broken vows, of violated pledges, of dishonored promises made at the marriage altar has been told repeatedly in the divorce courts, both of the United States and Europe. Among those who have figured in these trials are the leaders of society, those who set the fashions for the rest of the world to follow, those whose high positions ought to make them even more careful than others of lower rank in complying with the requirements of purity and morality. It is unnecessary for me to refer by name to the scandal trials, whose details have filled the columns of the greatest daily papers in the world, or to expand upon the shocking revelations of marital infidelity, of gross licentiousness, of unrestrained passion made in these trials. They tell their own story and carry their own moral. And yet it is fair to conclude that where one case of married unfaithfulness is thus brought before the world, scores remain secrets in the bosoms of the guilty persons. Licentiousness has ruined many of the greatest empires and republics in the world's history, and we may well tremble for the future of our beloved country when we reflect upon the thinly disguised profligacy which prevails among the wealthy and fashionable of our great cities. As to the unfaithful husbands among this class, their name is legion, and there is every reason to believe that the number of false wives is very much larger than we have any conception of. Truly it is a frightful thing to think of, and demands the earnest, thoughtful attention of all who wish to see the world better and purer. There is not a city or town in the country which has not its so-called fashionable scandals, not one in which the improprieties and adventures of beautiful and fascinating women in what are called the best circles are not subjects of public notoriety or matters of quiet gossip, not one in which the names of some of society's queens are not sullied with suspicions and tainted with doubts. This sad state of affairs is to be ascribed very largely to the popular social amusements and dissipations to which I have referred elsewhere. The dance, the theater, the wine cup, the racecourse, the idle frivolity and sensual luxury of the watering places, all have a tendency to draw the husband and wife apart, to make them depend less and less upon one another, to loosen the mutual obligations which should bind them together, to render them more and more unmindful of their sacred duties. Alas, all the lost women are not inmates of houses of shame. All the erring sisters are not known to the world as courtesans. There are many women in fashionable society who carry about in their bosoms the burden of guilty secrets, many who, despite their pretensions to purity and their external surroundings of propriety and respectability, are at heart and in fact as vile as those upon whom public sentiment has fixed the awful brand of shame, less excusable too because they have sinned without any reason, and succumbed to the wiles of the libertine. Although surrounded by comforts and luxuries and all the restraints of home and family and friends, there are skeletons in many closets which we do not dream of. Society, which admits notorious libertines and seducers to its parlors and drawing-rooms, while it excludes their helpless victims. Society, which fosters such immoral amusements as the dance and the theater. Society, which tolerates the grossest vices in the rich and the powerful, is just as much to blame for these scandals, for these dishonored homes, for these ghastly skeletons, as it is for the sin and wretchedness of the helpless slaves of open shame. All these things will continue until the tone of public sentiment is materially elevated, until the fashionable amusements which are now so popular are wiped out or radically changed, until husbands treat their wives with the tenderness and affection they accord to sweethearts, and look to home and family for the peace and happiness they now seek in fashionable excitement and dissipation, until the crime of matrimonial infidelity is constantly held up to the world in all its hideousness and deformity, and the consciences of the devotees of fashion are reached. Sexual sin is the crying evil of the day. Prostitution, open or secret, is sapping the vitals of our country's greatness, undermining its power, corrupting its youth, desolating its homes, breaking hearts, wrecking souls. Let us all, each to the extent of his ability and influence, great or small, do what he can to diminish this evil, to raise the tone of society, to save lovely maidens from the snares of the tempter, to punish the vile men who prey upon youth and innocence, to keep husbands and wives faithful and loyal to each other, aye, even to take from the street and the brothel the depraved outcast, and lead her to the Saviour, who said to the erring woman of Capernaum, "Thy sins, which are many, are forgiven." I cannot conclude this chapter better than by publishing a beautiful poem by Winona Rivers of Fort Wayne, Indiana, which holds up to the daughter of shame bright hope of salvation. Hope for the fallen. If any among ye be without sin, let him cast the first stone. I know there's a harp lying low by the river, its sweet beauty dimmed by a Magdalen's tears. She kneels there in sorrow, her frail arms extended. She pleads, but in vain, they turn a deaf ear. She is pleading to tell them the sorrowful story of a pure, perfect love that knew nothing of sin, a love that might have been any man's glory. She shyly and tenderly lavished on him, but her sisters pass by her. They scorn her sad story. The harp lying dark by the waters of sin may lie there forever, they will not restore it, nor make her dark life what it once would have been, had not the base tempter with sinister cunning and vile hellish arts, by pure woman upheld, stole into her Eden and plucked the bright jewel, leaving her to sorrow whatever befell. But listen, from whence come those sweet strains of music? The vibrating air wafts low where she lies. Her tear-bedimmed face she uplifts to the moonlight, with one pale slender hand she shades her dark eyes. She looks on in a scene that fills her with hatred. She sees her seducer, the cause of her sin, the center of honor, all eager to hear him, while wide through the land the earthly harps ring. Christian mothers smile on him, they bring their young daughters, in honor they place them upon his right hand, while she, the poor victim, left alone in her sorrow. Do you wonder a demon's let loose in the land? Then let us remember the words of our Saviour, nor scorn her who sits where the dark waters glide. The sweet harp of heaven shall not ring its full numbers, till redeemed in her whiteness she stands by his side. Winona Rivers, Fort Wayne, Allen County, Indiana. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Save the Girls by Mason Long. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How to save our erring sisters. Duty of the Church. What has been done in this field. In the preceding chapters I have endeavored in my feeble way to point out the main causes of the social evil, to describe the manifold temptations by which young girls are constantly surrounded, and which result in the ruin of so many of them, to show how society is responsible for the existence of so many of these temptations, and how unjustly and wickedly public sentiment forces girls who have taken a single false step down into the mire, and remorselessly keeps them down, closing the doors of all honorable avocations against them. I have related a number of sad stories from real life, each of which points its own moral in connection with the most vital and important subject upon which I have been writing. It is my purpose in this concluding chapter to make a few suggestions as to the duty of Christian people with reference to fallen women, and in relation to all the great problems of this most important subject. A little over 3 years ago, I was in the pursuit of a wild and reckless career. For many years, I had been steeped in all kinds of vice and debauchery. I had been a professional gambler, engrossed in all the evil practices and low amusements which that class of men revel in. My life had been for 15 years a succession of hideous orgies and bacchanalian revelries. One night I wandered into a temperance meeting in the city of my residence. Scarcely had I entered the building than I was surrounded by young men and women who earnestly implored me to sign the temperance pledge. Every one knew my personal character and past career, but in spite of all that they extended the right hand of fellowship to me, welcoming me heartily to the meeting, and used every effort to induce me to abandon intemperate habits and join the grand army of total abstinence. I attended the meetings for several evenings before I concluded to make an effort and sign the pledge. I finally took that step, and I have never regretted it for one moment. In another work I have told the story in detail, told how I was lifted up and encouraged by the temperance people of both sexes, how Christian men and women opened their doors to me, invited me to their homes, and endeavored, by every means in their power, to surround me with pure and holy influences and keep me in the better paths, which after long wanderings in the highways of sin I had chosen for the rest of my life journey. With these surroundings, I was soon led to embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ and enlist myself as an humble follower of the Lamb. No words can express my gratitude to those noble people who labored so hard to lift me up out of the degradation in which I had so long been steeped, and place my feet upon the solid rocks of temperance, virtue, and religion. I shall never cease to bless them and honor them and pray for God's blessing upon them while I live. I am but one of many men who had fallen very low, who have been redeemed through such agencies, and the good work still goes on. But ever since my reformation, I have been constantly asking of myself, if fallen men can be thus saved, why not fallen women? If men who have for long years been sunken in vice and debauchery, who have rioted in the blackest and most degrading excesses, who have scoffed at religion and sneered at virtue, whose consciences seemed to have died within them, if such men can thus be reformed and become virtuous, sober, religious, good, and useful members of society, can nothing be done for the wretched women who, like them, have been following a course of profligacy and recklessness? In my humble opinion, much, very much can be done to save fallen women. I have conversed upon this subject with a great many ministers of the gospel, and with scarcely an exception they agree with me that much can be accomplished in this direction, and that the Church should be alive to its duty. In my opinion, one of the most important things to attempt in this connection is an elevation of the tone of public sentiment. It is as important to save tens of thousands of young women, now pure and innocent, from joining the ranks of the fallen, as it is to rescue those who have already plunged into the vortex. How is this to be done? I answer, in many ways. We must look for the causes which lead to prostitution, and if possible destroy them in their incipiency. We must endeavor to remove the many temptations which society now throws about young girls, and thus lures them to their ruin. The pulpit must thunder against the theater, the wine cup, the races, the dance, and the many other fashionable amusements of the day, which, seductive and fascinating as they may appear to the young, yet result in many wrecked and blasted lives, many disgraced and deserted homes, many broken hearts, and many lost souls. If you would have your daughters modest, pure, and virtuous, teach them to shun these attractive pleasures as they would the crawling serpent. So long as these fashionable amusements are encouraged or even tolerated, so long will libertines and seducers ply their devilish arts with success, and gather in thousands of fresh victims. So long will myriads of pure, modest young maidens be tempted across the line of virtue into the dwellings of shame. So long will the great procession of disease and death move on, leaving woe and desolation in its pathway, and sweeping many precious souls into an eternity of blackest night. A great step can be taken in the way of saving young women from ruin by affording avenues of useful and honorable employment to all who desire to earn their bread without shame. I have pointed out in this volume the sad fact that a very large proportion of our fallen women are made such by poverty. They are unable to obtain work, and even if they do succeed, in a majority of instances they are scarcely paid enough to keep body and soul together. The sewing girl, toiling 12 or 14 hours out of the 24 in a close, ill-ventilated room, bending over her machine and contracting those fell diseases, dyspepsia and consumption. The saleswoman standing upon her feet as many hours in each day in a crowded store. The factory girl, toiling the livelong day at arduous work. These and many other poor women working like slaves and not earning enough to purchase proper food and suitable clothing turn at last in despair to the paths of forbidden sin, and exchange starving virtue for feasting vice. When the glad day comes that all girls are educated with a view to possible dependence upon their own resources, and when public sentiment will not justify employers in paying men what they earn and women only half so much, when that day comes, one of the great fountains of prostitution will be dried up. But until that day, women in want will look upon the full purse of the libertine with envy, and will fall. Of course, so long as we tolerate in men what we condemn in women, so long will the ranks of vice be filled. When we apply the same standard in judging men that we now use in judging women, there will be a great purification in our morals. When libertines, seducers, and adulterers find themselves excluded from decent society, debarred from official position, and shunned by the refined and the virtuous, when pure young maidens demand of their would-be husbands as chaste records as they themselves possess, when the vows taken at the marriage altar are held to be as binding upon the man as upon the woman, when these desirable changes are brought about, the domain of sexual vice will be handed over to the exclusive possession of those who make no claims to respectability or decency, and the social evil will find itself confined to narrow boundaries. I admit that this day seems far distant, but each can do something toward hastening it. The churches can do much, and I know that, as a rule, our clergymen would gladly take the lead if their hands were not shackled by public sentiment. I have just touched upon the various means which may be adopted to save young women from becoming prostitutes. Now let us consider how we may reach those who have already fallen. I have conversed with a number of clergymen upon this subject, and they all seem anxious to do what they can in this direction. But they complain that they cannot get the sympathy and support of their congregations. Those who are the most earnest and active in their efforts to save fallen men, who are ever ready to give to the most besotted drunkard the right hand of fellowship, who are zealous in every good work but this, shrug their shoulders and stand aloof when the claims of the fallen sisterhood are presented to their attention. With very few exceptions, it is almost impossible to interest women in their unfortunate sisters. women who will use every effort to lift the drunkard out of the gutter and to reform the most vicious and desperate of men. Women who are foremost in every charity seem to have little compassion upon their wretched sisters. If a clergyman tries to do anything for these poor outcasts, his motives are ofttimes impugned, his character is questioned, and not seldom he finds his usefulness in other fields of labor at an end. Women generally seem to have unlimited confidence in the success of efforts to save fallen men, but none at all in any project for the elevation of the fallen of their own sex. They proverbially say that it is no use to try, that the courtesans of the city are hopelessly degraded, and that there is nothing to be done but let them drift on to destruction. So long as this spirit is alive among the female members of our churches, so long will our ministers find it very difficult to accomplish much in trying to save fallen women. In any good work, the clergyman must have not only the sympathy but the prayers, the cordial support, the active cooperation of his flock. But when instead of these he meets with sneers and shrugs and covert opposition and sly innuendos and predictions of failure, he can of course accomplish little. In my conversation and correspondence with ministers, I have found them, almost without exception, alive to the great importance of this field of labor, fully conscious that it is being neglected, and exceedingly anxious to do something. Many of them have tried to awaken the sensibilities of their congregations in this matter, but their success has not been up to the measure of their expectations. A great many of them have undertaken systematic labors among the women of shame, with varying success. Most of them report that there are many difficulties to overcome, and so there are. But with faith and prayer and steady, persevering work, these obstacles can be removed. All who have done work among this unfortunate class report that they find some women so utterly degraded, so completely abandoned to all sense of decency, so entirely reckless as to be apparently beyond the reach of any human agency. But these are not in the majority. In most of the fallen women something is found which can be appealed to, some tender chord in their bosoms which can be touched, some sweet recollection of youth and home which can be revived, some memory of a father or a mother or a sister or brother, or perchance of a dearer one still and a nearer one yet, which may be called up, some deep yearning after modesty and virtue, some inherent aspiration for a better life, some hope of salvation in the future which may be resuscitated. Many times the impressions thus produced may prove transitory and fade away, but the tender chord has been touched, the better feelings have been once more aroused, and there is something to work on. In such cases, perseverance will be almost sure to bring a glorious reward, and the woman in whom so much remains that is good may be saved from her life of ignominy. Those who have labored in this vineyard are surprised at many things they learn of the secret lives of fallen women. In a majority of instances, these unfortunate beings have many noble traits of character which shine out to especial advantage in contrast with their reckless and dissolute lives. Very frequently they have children whom they dearly love, and whom they are educating at schools and colleges, and bringing them up in ignorance of their mother's shame or even of her identity. These women keep aloof from their children, whom they would give all their treasure to see, in order that those loved ones may enter the world without any idea of their origin. Not a few young men and young women are today attending our best educational institutions, whose mothers, whom they believe to be dead, are inmates of houses of sin in our large cities. In a great many cases, fallen women devote much of their earnings to the support of indigent relatives, perhaps of parents or sisters or brothers, and not infrequently of more distant relatives. In other ways, these fallen creatures show generosity and charity. Of course, these things do not in the least excuse their manner of life, but they show that there is something of good left in them, some foundation for better things, some encouragement for those who seek to elevate them morally and socially. A great many instances might be related of women who have been lifted from the lowest depths, taken out of the very slums, as it were, and have become active, consistent Christians and useful members of society. The great evangelist Moody, who has labored so much among this unfortunate class in our large cities, in a sermon to erring women, related the following incident. At one of my meetings in Philadelphia, a fallen woman came into the inquiry room and threw herself down on the floor. The Christian helpers talked and talked to her, but could get nothing out of her. They couldn't do a thing with her. The Honorable George H. Stewart came to me and said, "We wish you would come. We don't know what to make of her." She was weeping bitterly, and as far off as I was, I could hear her sobs all over the room. So I went and said, "What is the trouble?" At last she spoke, and the bitterness of her despairing voice went to my heart. "I have fallen from everything pure, and God cannot save me. There is no hope." I told her tenderly that God could still lift her up and save her. I said, "Are you only just willing to be forgiven? A merciful Father is waiting and longing to pardon." She said at last she could not abandon her course, as no one would give her a home. But that difficulty was got around by my assuring her kind friends would provide for her, and then she yielded, and that same day was given a pleasant place in the home of a Presbyterian minister. But for 48 hours after entering her new home, that poor reclaimed woman cried day and night. And we went for her mother, and on hearing her story, she clasped her hands and cried, "Has my daughter really repented? Thank God for his mercy. My heart has just been breaking. I prayed so long for her without result. Take me to her." And that reformed daughter of sin has lived consistently ever since, and when I was last in Philadelphia, she was one of the most esteemed members in that Presbyterian church. In one of the thriving towns of northern Indiana 2 or 3 years since, a large number were savingly converted and added to the Baptist church of that place, the pastor of which was a most ardent and zealous Christian worker. Several fallen men were brought into the fold, and a great many of the world's people were blessed with a change of heart. Among those who attended the meetings and exhibited the deepest interest were 2 women of the town. They were present at every meeting and seemed greatly impressed. The pastor, noticing their constant presence at the services and their evident earnestness, but knowing nothing of their characters and past history, did his utmost to bring them into the fold. Soon he found that he was severely censured by many of his congregation, because of the notoriety these women had attained. But he was satisfied that they were under conviction, that they had repented in sackcloth and ashes of their sins, and were yearning to lead better and purer lives in the future. He felt it his duty to do what lay in his power to assist them, and hence he labored with all his zeal for their conversion. The result was all and even more than he could hope for. The fallen sisters made a public profession of Christ, and in spite of the lack of confidence on the part of a number of the church members, were admitted to the church. They met with little recognition or encouragement, but so pure, consistent, and blameless have been their lives, that they have now forced the respect and confidence even of those who sneered and scoffed at them when they first attended the revival meetings. The pastor informed me that he had among his flock no more zealous, earnest, and active Christian than one of these women, who so long traveled in the forbidden paths of sinful pleasure, and seemed to all external appearances to be hopelessly lost. A clergyman of the M.E. Church told me of an incident somewhat similar to the above, which occurred during his pastoral experience. He was conducting a series of protracted meetings. A feeling of deep religious interest pervaded the community, and a rich harvest of souls was being reaped for Christ. At one of the meetings, several women of bad reputation entered the church and took their seats. During the exercises of the evening they were greatly affected, and were evidently under deep conviction. They wept freely, and seemed to feel a profound sense of their lost condition. After the preaching, it was customary at these meetings for the pastor to invite all who were desirous of the prayers of God's people to go forward to the mourners' bench. On the evening in question he was requested by several prominent members of his church not to make the usual announcement. "For if you do," they said, "those women will come forward and will want to join our church. This will cause a great scandal." The minister very promptly told these prominent members that salvation was open to all, even to fallen women, and that they were not the kind of soldiers that were needed in the army of the Lord. The fallen sisters went to the mourners' bench and asked for the prayers of God's people. These prayers were answered, and the repentant courtesans were admitted to the church and are still useful and consistent members thereof. An humble but devout member of one of the leading churches of Fort Wayne was, but 5 years ago, one of the most vile and degraded of women. Ever since she was admitted to the church, she has given every evidence of sincere, heartfelt repentance, and her life has been as pure and blameless as the most exacting critic could wish. I might multiply these instances almost indefinitely, but enough has been related to show that the vilest harlot of the streets is not beyond the reach of divine grace. If our churches would but sustain the clergymen in their efforts to reach this most miserable and unfortunate class, very many of them would be saved from lives of degradation and become useful members of society. The great trouble seems to be that, having once determined to reform and to lead better and purer lives, they receive so little encouragement from those who should lend them helping hands. On the contrary, they are beset with obstacles at every step, and are discouraged and disheartened by the sneers, the jibes, and the unkind predictions uttered by those whose solemn duty it is to aid these erring ones in every possible way. Away off in Jerusalem, nearly 1900 years ago, our Savior one day sat at meat in the house of Simon, a wealthy Pharisee. As he entered this house, he was followed by a sinful woman of the town, and in her hands she carried an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet behind him weeping, and began to wash his feet with her tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Of course the Pharisees, then as now, marveled greatly that the Savior would allow a poor lost woman to come near him. But he rebuked them, and after one of his beautiful parables said, "Simon, seest thou this woman? I entered into thy house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears, and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. Mine head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And he said unto her, Thy sins are forgiven. Thy faith hath saved thee. Go in peace." One day, while the Savior was teaching in the temple on the Mount of Olives, the scribes and Pharisees brought before him a woman who had been taken in adultery, caught in the very act, there to receive the sentence which the Jewish law provided for fallen women, that she be stoned to death. The man who sinned with the woman was not taken. He was allowed to escape, and the poor victim of his passions was left to bear all the burden, all the shame, all the punishment. There she stood in the temple before the vast multitude who were listening to the Lord's preaching, awaiting her doom. In all that great crowd there was no one to speak a word for the adulteress, none to extend a kindly hand towards her, none to demand that her infamy be shared by the man who had seduced her. The crowd clamored for the stoning of the woman, but Jesus uttered those memorable words, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." But the stone wasn't thrown. One by one those who had been clamoring for the fallen woman's blood slunk away, rebuked by their own consciences. And when Jesus lifted up his eyes, he saw the woman standing before him all alone, and he said, "Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee?" She said, "No man, Lord." And Jesus said unto her, "Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more." It was not the business of Christ to take the law into his own hands and enforce it. That was the duty of the Jewish magistrate. Hence he said, "Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more." Reader, there are thousands of fallen women all over the land who can be saved if but the proper effort is made. There are thousands of pure women who can be preserved from the awful fate to which they are hastening, if we but stretch forth our hands. Shall we try? Or shall we continue to open our doors to the seducers and the libertines, and drive out their wronged, helpless victims to shame and infamy? Shall we still honor those vices in men which we loathe in women? Shall we go into the highways and byways, pick the fallen men out of the gutters, and leave the fallen women to perish? Shall we forget that most of these miserable outcasts, whose wrecked womanhood awakens our disgust, were made what they are by the diabolical machinations of wicked men? God pity them. God help them to rise out of the mire in which they are so deeply sunken, and turn their faces heavenward. End of chapter 9. End of Save the Girls by Mason Long.